Hello and welcome to tonight's Festival of Debate event. I am currently seeing some noises in the chat about there not being any noise. I hope there is now noise. We were just giving everybody a few more minutes to get in and get settled to the webinar. So welcome. The Festival of Debate is currently in its 8th year. It is run by the not-for-profit and social enterprise Opus Independence based in Sheffield. We do still have another couple of weeks. Well, a bit less than a couple of weeks until the 30th of May, until the end of the festival. So there are plenty more events for you to get involved in. So do check them out at festivalofdebate.com and have a look for us on all of the usual social media channels to join in the conversation. So that's more than enough from me. I'm going to hand over now to Vicky Seddon and Gordon Dabinet, our hosts for the evening. And I hope you have an absolutely wonderful night.
Thank you very much. And welcome everyone to this session being run by Sheffield for Democracy in association with the Festival of Debate. And the title of our session is called Time for a New Democracy. Very pleased to have you all here with us. I'm Vicky Seddon and I'm the coordinator of Sheffield for Democracy, which is a local group which campaigns on both national and local matters. Locally, we watch and comment on how our local council works and the opportunities for local people to have their say and to influence local decisions. And we've cooperated with the Sheffield Climate Alliance, which is now the South Yorkshire Climate Alliance. We've been to public sessions of the South Mayoral Combined Authority and we've asked the Mayor questions and we continue to do that. And we're not just active on local matters, national issues are also of concern to us. Our national partners include Unlock Democracy, Make Votes Matter, the Electoral Reform Society, and we've worked with them on voting systems and on challenging the centralisation of political powers, which of course undermines local democracy and especially through its financing. Most recently, the Elections Bill, now the Elections Act, has been of major concern. We've been in contact with not just our MPs but also members of the House of Lords, where much of the serious debate about the bill and attempt to amend it positively took place. Unfortunately, most of those amendments were defeated in the end, and so our democracy was further undermined, including by weakening the independence and authority of the Electoral Commission, and also by requiring photo ID at polling stations. It seems to us that our democracy isn't just blemished, it's not fit for purpose, it's broken. When our elected MPs cannot or will not hold the government to account for law breaking, for dishonesty in Parliament, for getting away with things, then it's time for an upheaval. Not just for tweaking, but for major change. The structure of our democracy, what our constitution consists of, how we elect our politicians, the operation of our public institutions, where powers lie and how those powers are held to account, whether localities have control over local matters. Structure is one aspect of its brokenness, but culture within our political structures is another. How people behave, how they speak to each other, the expectations, these impact on the power structures and influence how women, how people of different ethnicities, of different sexualities, of age and disability fare in those power structures. This brokenness and how we can go about fixing it is what we want to spend time on this evening. Yes, we have our speakers and we're very pleased to have you all here and thank you for making time to come and be with us. But we also want to include all of you who are in this webinar in the discussion. We want to hear your perspectives too. So I'm now going to hand over to Gordon Dabinet, who's part of our steering group, who is chairing this evening. And I hope it's going to be a fruitful discussion. Over to you, Gordon.
Thank you, Vicky, and good evening to everyone. What I'll briefly do is outline how we intend the event to run, and I can ask you, if you do have questions, to put them in the Q&A box, and then we'll try and pick those up later. We have 4 members of our panel, Paul Blomfield, MP for Sheffield Central, Shahida Saddique, who is CEO of Faithstar, a social enterprise, and is social activist in Sheffield as well. They will be the main speakers, putting their views on the need for a new democracy, and from their perspectives, what that might entail, what particular changes they would like to see. We'll then have more brief responses from Django Perks. Django Perks is a member of the Sheffield Youth Cabinet member, and so we're very pleased for him to be with us this evening to provide a young person's perspective on this issue as well. And then finally, we'll hear a contribution from Anesu Matanda Mambingo. Anesu is the Welfare and Sustainability Officer of Sheffield Students' Union, and she might want to reflect on the climate crisis, having attended the COP meeting in Glasgow, and obviously making perhaps connections to that important issue. So the first panelist we'll hear from is Paul Blomfield. So thank you, Paul, for attending this evening, and we look forward to what you have to say. Over to you, Paul.
Okay, well, thanks, Gordon. Thanks to Opus for the festival debate, because I think it's a great Sheffield event. And thanks to Sheffield for Democracy for organising this strand within it, because I think it's a hugely important time to be looking at the state of our democracy and what we need to do about it. I've only been a member of Parliament for the last 12 years, although I spent most of the previous 50 or so from the age of 16 involved in democratic politics. And the reason that a reason that I chose to stand for election in 2010 was because I was worried about the state of our democracy. That was after the expenses scandal involving MPs, which had further corroded confidence. And I wanted to explore what I could do modestly as an individual member of Parliament to build confidence in democratic politics, and to do that because above party allegiance, that confidence in democratic politics matters. It matters because it's clearly right that we should all have a say in how our lives can be lived, how our societies are organized. Democratic countries are fairer because democracy drives society towards more equal distribution of wealth. And it's an important check on the power of leaders. You know, if, looking topically, you know, if Russia was a functioning democracy, and by that I would sort of define that as politicians elected freely by all citizens, respect for human rights and the rule of law, freedom of expression and the right to protest with a free press and media. If Russia was that sort of functioning democracy, we'd not now have a war in Ukraine, because Putin would be constrained from the action he's taken by those forces. I guess the other point I want to make is that I think that we too often, across Western democracies, take democracy for granted. We need to just remember democracy as a way of organising society is still relatively young. Now, we've only had a full democracy in the UK in terms of when the franchise was properly extended to women for less than 100 years. And within that period, we've seen democracies fail badly, most notably Germany in the 1930s and the consequences that that had for our continent. And, you know, even in my lifetime, which is longer than some people's here, but, you know, roughly the same as Gordon's and Vicky's, you know, most of the countries in the European Union have been governed by other than democracies. You know, Spain was fascist, Portugal was fascist, Greece, there was a military dictatorship, all of Eastern Europe run by authoritarian regimes. So we really mustn't take democracy for granted. We have to recognize that it's something that we work hard at to defend and to strengthen. And this is Now, this is an important time because I think democracy is under threat, both externally and from within. Externally, and it's a profound threat, and I'm not just talking about Putin's war in Ukraine, which does challenge Western democracies. But if we recognize that political influence in the world is based on economic power, within the next 10 years, China's going to overtake the United States as the world's biggest economy. No, within probably the 20 years after that, it may be an economy bigger than all of the Western economies combined. That is a profound shift in the balance of power in the world. For the first time in the history of modern democracy, the world's leading economic power will be an anti-democratic authoritarian regime. And we only have to look at how the Chinese are stripping away democratic rights in Hong Kong, the treatment of the Uyghurs, the organization of Chinese society itself, the response to the pandemic. We don't know what the effect of that will be, but yesterday afternoon, I spent an hour talking with the foreign minister of Somaliland, one of the exemplary democracies within Africa, and we were talking about the way in which China was developing a new colonialism in the way that it was compromising and economically engaging with many African countries. So the real external challenge. Internally, there are also issues we need to face across the Western democracies. Now, people talk often about participation rates falling, and that is a fact, but they're not actually falling as dramatically as sometimes the narrative suggests. I mean, from the first full franchise election general election in 1929, we saw general participation rates of in the mid 70% level. That's declined over the last 20 years to the high 60%. That's not satisfactory, but it's something we should address. But it's not significant. Read Robert Tressel's Ragged Trouser Philanthropist and the cynicism about democracy that's always existed. There's always been a lack of trust and confidence. Now that's been exacerbated over a recent period. I talked about the expenses scandal. We've got some of the appalling stuff that's happening in Westminster at the moment, which kind of tarnishes all of us, even though it's largely Conservative MPs who are involved, and that's damaging. We've also got a period where, as I mentioned a moment ago, in terms of China, how does democracy operate within a period of relative economic decline, and what challenges does that what does that pose to us? We've seen a change in the way that people engage in democracy, in terms of their identity. Traditional identification with political parties was based on class. Now it's based on new identities. And that probably reflects a changing, substantial changes in our economy and the movement of the way that people work. And we could talk about that. But it has created space for new political forces. We've seen the emergence of populism. Trump is a good example in the States. You know, when he talks about make America great, we should be clear, the subliminal message there was about making white America great. He was trying to build a base with working class voters in traditional Democratic areas, Democrat areas, across the Rust Belt. We've seen Le Pen again take those traditional voters for a party of the far right in France and across Europe. Parties of the right exploiting national and racial identities where previously voters were focused on class identities. There's a really good book which I'd recommend by a couple of American political scientists, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, which sets out warnings to us about the internal threats to democracy. It's called How Democracies Die. And they make the point that democracies don't only die at the point of a gun, as we saw, I don't know, in Germany in the 30s, Chilean democracy in the 70s when Allende was overthrown. But they can be corroded internally. And they were looking at the Trump era, even before the attempted coup, about how democracy could be destroyed by elected politicians corroding it from within, out of the interest of maintaining their own power. They talked about the way in which the guardrails of democracy could be removed, the way in which institutions which counterbalance the body politic, the judiciary, the media, could be attacked and undermined, and values, human rights is at the center of that, could be undermined. Tipping the way in which politicians could tip the rules in their own favor rather than in maintaining the integrity of the democratic process. Now we saw Trump do it. We've seen Putin do it with the strangle the young democracy that was emerging in Russia. But there are also echoes here in the UK, and Vicky alluded to some of them. I think with Boris Johnson and Boris Johnson's Conservative Party, we have a different sort of Conservative Party, and I'm not making a partisan point here. Chris Patten, a former leader, chair of the Conservative Party, I think under Margaret Thatcher, makes the point that they are no longer a Conservative Party, but an English nationalist party. And they certainly operate in a very different way. They are currently threatening the powers of the courts to hold governments to account, because they didn't like the courts reaching judgments that they were acting unlawfully in proroguing Parliament over Brexit, or they don't like people using the courts through judicial reviews to hold the executive to account. They attack activist lawyers who use the law to hold the executive to account. They've been undermining the BBC and threatening to chill the freedom. And on the elections bill, which Vicky mentioned, absolutely out of the Republican playbook in the States on voter suppression. They are requiring photo ID to vote in person, and we'll see the impact of that in next year's local elections. They're requiring that not because they believe in the integrity of the democratic process, but because they know it will suppress the votes of those who tend not to vote for them. They know that poorer, minority ethnic voters may not have access to the same sort of photo ID that others have. And in terms of the youth vote, for example, they've allowed in London the Oyster card. You can get an over 60s Oyster card. They've allowed that as suitable ID for participation in votes. But they resisted an amendment in the House of Lords for the youth Oyster card to be used as ID in the elections, because they know young people tend not to vote for them and old people do tend to vote for them. The second strand of the elections bill, which Vicky mentioned, is they're taking the Electoral Commission there as an independent body to monitor our democracy under government control by giving ministers the right to set its strategy and policies and putting it under the supervision of government minister. They're changing the way that we vote for mayors and police and crime commissioners from a supplementary vote system to first past the post. They're not doing that because they think it's a better system. They're doing it because they've done the arithmetic and they know it's likely to produce more Tory mayors and police and crime commissioners. And they're also kind of removing the restriction on British citizens who've been resident overseas for more than 15 years from voting in elections. They tend to vote Tory. So this is changing our electoral system, and this is unprecedented. That this hasn't happened with previous Conservative governments. They're changing our political system to their political advantage, and this needs to be exposed and challenged. And the core of the problem that Levitsky and Zablak talk about in their book is the breakdown of mutual toleration, as they describe it, and the breakdown of respect for the political legitimacy of the opposition. And toleration is about accepting the results of free and fair elections, for example, which Trump didn't do. I mean, that was extraordinary. Instead, advocating the overthrow of a legitimate result on the basis of spurious complaints and trying to take control of the electoral system for that purpose. It's also asserting the importance of respecting the opinions of those who have legitimately different political opinions, as opposed to attacking the patriotism of any who disagree, or warning that if your opponent comes to power, they're going to destroy the country. Now, I get that all the time from this particular Conservative government. In the House of Commons, we saw the way in which judges were attacked during the Brexit debacle. So what we've got to do is, coming on to solutions to wind up my contribution, we've got to work hard together to restore democratic norms and extend them through our increasingly diverse societies. That means working with under-engaged groups. Young people are the critical group, and I'm delighted at the composition of the panel this evening. Since the franchise was extended to under 21s, extended to 18-year-olds, we've seen young people 18 to 24s generally about 10 points below over 65s in their participation in elections. We hit a couple of low points in 2005 and 2015 where that dropped to about 30 points behind. I mean, in the 2015 election, if young people had voted at the same rate as over 65s, we would not have seen a Conservative government, we would not have seen a Brexit referendum, and we would not have seen we'd not have seen Boris Johnson. Our policies would be profoundly different. Black, Asian and minority ethnic participation has been improving over the last 3 elections, from being about 14 points behind to being about 8 points behind, but still needs to, is an issue which I'm sure Shahida will talk about. Even more strikingly is social class. It's difficult to get figures on electoral participation, but in terms of political activity, people in social class AB are twice as likely to be engaged in political activity as those in DE. Now, there are practical issues, actions that we can take, which I'm sure that we will talk about. I've always believed in extending vote for a very long time, extending votes to 16-year-olds, linked to political education and voter registration in schools, because we do know from all the evidence, if people are engaged in the political process early, they tend to stick with it. I think we should, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, move to proportional representation, so that people can vote positively and engage positively with parties of choice, rather than what we've got at the moment, which is more often voting to deny political power to your opponents. It would profoundly change the way that we operate as well, away from binary politics to a more collaborative politics. We can look at deliberative democracy, citizen assemblies. Tough, hard to make sure that they involve people as broadly as we might like, bearing in mind who tends to participate and who tends to stay away from democracy. But there's issues there to look at. And we need to look at devolution of power. The European Union was based on important principles, subsidiarity, that decisions should be made as close to people as possible. And I think that's a principle that we should embrace. But we also need to recognize that we shouldn't overwhelm people with democratic opportunities to the point that it excludes those who don't have the kind of sharp elbows and willingness to engage of some of the more active middle classes. So there are practical actions there, but above all, we need to recognize there are no quick fixes, but that this sort of discussion is hugely important, because we've got to work hard at cherishing, building, and winning support for democracy.
Thanks very much, Paul. call to action as much as anything else there. And I think some very important issues that we will try and follow up later. As I said earlier, if you do have questions, if you could put them in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. I've picked up one already, so we'll address that at the end of the panel. The next speaker, I'm inviting Shahida Saddique, as I said previously, is CEO of Faithstar and has been active in a number of social and community activities in the city of Sheffield. So Shahida, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Paul, for that sort of macro, big picture discussion there. I want to actually kind of bring this down to Sheffield level, local democracy and the importance of that at a local level. We've gone through some quite significant changes with the announcement of the new collective collaborative committee system that's taken place. And with the local elections that have just happened as well, there were some quite interesting things that came out there. One of the things that was really struck me about the recent local elections, and whether it's my esteemed colleague Paul Blomfield, or whether it's local councillors such as Terry Fox, who've been around for a long time, whether it's newer councillors such as Malachi Haby from the Green Party, or Nighat Basharat from Labour, and again, other ones such as Shafqat Mohammed, who've been around for a long time from the Liberal Democrats. One of the things that struck me is that local people who are trusted within their communities, known by their communities, active within their communities, and very much kind of part and parcel of the fabric of their communities, have a much greater impact on the political spectrum in terms of engagement. And I think that's something, there's something to be grasped there in terms of democracy and what democracy means for us, because when we're talking about devolved decision making through statutory agencies, so we have things like the levelling up funding, we have things such as the new integrated care system, all of these things that are suddenly happening around us, and Paul touched on many of the different changes that are happening around us. Actually, one of the key things that's going to underpin all of that is how we get local voice, the things that impact local people into those decision-making structures. And now with this new committee system that we have in Sheffield as well, it is going to be interesting. I mean, there are inherent risks to all of that. The inherent risks are that people across the political spectrum don't do what's best for Sheffield and Sheffield citizens, but play party politics, for example, and could potentially hold, committees and decisions to ransom because of that. So there is that inherent risk. The opportunity, though, the opportunity to work collaboratively, behave differently, and I think Paul mentioned the word earlier, mutual toleration, that giving space for different perspectives, that giving space for different voices is going to be absolutely key. And I think we have an opportunity in Sheffield to not only do politics differently, but to demonstrate how we can respond to our citizens in a way in which is not just responsive to their needs, but actually caters to some of the, we've got some of the major issues coming down, and this isn't just in Sheffield, but nationally and internationally, everything from climate change to the cost of living, to the potential of, we've just come out of one pandemic. There's no guarantee that we might not go into another pandemic in the future, as the space that we're sharing in the world gets smaller and smaller in terms of the proliferation of viruses and things like that. So actually in Sheffield, what we do here, and how we treat each other on a political spectrum, but how we respond to those sort of big macro external issues and how they impact us internally and locally is going to be really profound. And I just want to touch on a number of things, really. One is around, I was very lucky. I grew up in a generation where I was mentored and supported by a whole range of people right across the political spectrum, from a whole range of different backgrounds, everything from, being, taught, radical community transformation from faith leaders to community organizing, from local activists and everything in between. So I've been very privileged, But I also know that there are whole generations and whole sections of our communities that aren't politically engaged, that have not had those opportunities, that haven't had that engagement. And I think one of the core things about democracy that we really have to protect are the principles of democracy, are educating people about their rights, educating people and raising awareness of the structures that are around people and where they can influence decisions and how they can influence decisions. And when we talk about disconnected people, disenfranchised people, people who are just kind of like, oh, there's apathy here, you know, along the political system. Yes, there will be, because actually there are, you know, we're kind of in an age where there's social media and there's all of this kind of, oh yeah, you know, people have got information at their fingertips. Well, yeah, but whose information and who's pushing that information? And actually, you know, there is nothing more powerful than meeting somebody face to face, and there is nothing more powerful than walking alongside somebody. And you know, if people are facing difficulties and issues, whatever that might be, coming alongside somebody and saying, you know, you're facing a debt, I can help you with debt. You're facing a food crisis, I can help you, you know, with that poverty, and all these kinds of things. The people that make the difference, and I'm passionate about the voluntary community faith social enterprise sector because that's my natural home. But it is those people in those communities, those organisations and that sector who have to pick up the gaps, who have to fill in the gaps when, you know, the public sector fails in its duty, when the private sector becomes too enamoured of profit because it places profit before people, and how do we respond to that? And I think there is something really important about scrutiny and accountability, but also demonstrable action taken when people fail to do what they're supposed to do. And you know, we have things like the Nolan principle in public life, and we've seen what the national government is doing. As somebody who worked with Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities in Sheffield and the faith communities in Sheffield as a tactical lead for responding to COVID, some of the most heartbreaking things I had to deal with was, you know, saying to people, I'm so sorry you can't go to the hospital to say goodbye to your loved ones, and you're going to have to make that sacrifice because it's for the greater good. And then when our national government broke the rules during the pandemic, broke those rules with Partygate and everything else, it cut deep. The failure to abide by rules, the failure to abide by rules that you created, that you expected everybody else to abide by, and then you chose to break them, really cut deep. And it cut deep because the reason that we gave to people to, you know, the number of times I had to say no to people was for, I know this hurts and I know you're grieving and I know this means so much to you and this has impacted you, but you can't, because actually there are all these other people that it could impact. There's all the, you know, we have a rule, this rule has been made at this particular time and it's for everybody. And, you know, families and individuals and communities right across Sheffield and right across the country abided by rules. And I think that sacrifice outside of yourself, which is, you know, I'm doing this, this isn't just about me and my family, this is about somebody else and their family. And so therefore I'm going to do this. That was heartbreaking. And I think that is something that we have to really cherish when it comes to democracy. The pandemic showed that actually when it came to democratic principles up and down this country, people put each other before themselves. And I think the fragility of democracy lies in the moment it doesn't become about other people. It breaks when it becomes about a few and not for everybody. And I think that's the core principles that we have to cherish about democracy. I think in terms of the changes around how people can elect, if you look at everything from the immigration bill to the election bill that Vicky was talking about earlier, if you talk about, you know, the way in which the police and crime bill, the changes around how we can elect commissioners and mayors and so on and so forth, some of the things that Paul touched on earlier, the question is how do we safeguard, what is the counterbalance to ensuring those democratic structures, those democratic principles that are there for all of us are retained for all of us, and particularly for those communities who are marginalized and othered, they're the easy ones. They're the easy targets. They're the targets that, you know, if we do A, B, and C, these people are unvoiced, and these people will not have accessibility to the things that they need accessibility to in order to exercise their rights and voice. And democratic principles, if we don't, and I suppose in some ways it's like this, you know, if we don't look after the most vulnerable in our society, if we don't protect those rights for the most vulnerable, then we shouldn't be too surprised if those principles and rights are eroded for us. And I think, as Vicky was saying, you know, there are those of us with sharp elbows, and we can fight for our rights. But what happens to those people who can't? And I think it is so important that when we're talking about democratic principles, when we're talking about the fragility of our democracy and the importance of our democracy, actually, and as Paul said earlier, we are a young democracy. The world looks to us. How do we do it? You know, and where the example that others hold up, where the aspiration that other new emerging democracies will look to and say, you know, that's how we want to do it. We want freedom of speech. We want freedom of media. We want freedom to express our faith, gender, sexuality, disability, whatever we are and however we are. We want to feel safe in our own space and circumstances. And it isn't just that we're protecting this for ourselves, we're protecting it for others as well. And I'll give you a quick example of that. We're doing some work around the criminal justice system, around joint enterprise. Joint enterprise impacts young Black and brown marginalised young people to a larger proportion than it does the rest of society. Now, the interesting thing about the joint enterprise laws is that the rest of the world follows our joint enterprise laws. And that is, if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time with a group of friends, you could end up facing a life sentence just because you happen to be in the wrong place, or you happen to pick up the wrong text or pick up the wrong friend in a car. And you could have people as young as 12 facing 17, 18, 20 years, or even a life sentence in prison for nothing other than answering a text. And one of the things about that is, you know, we have an organization called Jengba who are doing some amazing work in this field. They've gone all the way to Parliament, they've changed the legislation, they're fighting for those changes to be enacted. But the phenomenal thing about that is if we do that in the UK, that will change joint enterprise laws around the world. America will look to us, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all these are the places that currently base some of their legislative principles on what we do. It could have the impact of changing hundreds of thousands of lives, not just in the UK, but around the world. And that's why us fighting for our democratic structures, our democratic principles, isn't just about what we do in the UK. What we do in the UK is held up as an example for the rest of the world. And I think at times when, you know, we look at what's happening in Brazil, we look at what's happening in France and in other parts of the world, you know, people coming together at a grassroots level, people looking at the alternatives. We don't have to look too far back in history to see the impact of fascism, authoritarianism, and anti-democratic countries. We have those examples, and we have that in living memory. And so people can look at that and go, well, do I really want to go back to that? No. But I think what we have to be careful of is the apathy that can develop, the idea that, oh, well, I don't need to go out and vote because somebody else will pick up that vote. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. And I think it's that engagement that we need to reignite and inspire, not just a whole new generation of people, but we need to reach out to those parts of our society and those parts of our community that have closed themselves off and said, you know what? There are people who can advocate for you. You can advocate for yourself. And here's the way in which you can do it. And part of that re-education, part of that re-engagement is the personal. And like I said earlier, there's nothing more powerful than sitting with somebody, eating with somebody, walking with somebody, supporting somebody on a face-to-face physical basis. And I know that the pandemic has made that really difficult in the last 2.5 years to meet people face-to-face, but there is nothing as powerful as the human touch, holding somebody's hand and saying, you know what, you're on a really tough road or a really tough path, but I'm here and I'm here to support you and I'm here to do what I can. And that makes, just knowing somebody else is there for you or with you has a profound impact, because by nature, human beings are social beings. We need each other. And democracy demonstrates the power of human connection, because it isn't about you, it's about taking it outside of yourself and doing stuff on behalf of others. So I think there's a lot to go through, there's a lot to think about. We have everything to fight for. I think Sheffield is entering a very, very interesting period right now, and I think across the political spectrum in Sheffield, we have an opportunity to put our citizens first. We have an opportunity to put aside the party politics and actually work for the constituents, a little bit like kind of shifting into proportional representation, you know, answering to those people that have elected us and our constituents and saying, well, actually, you know, I'm putting your needs first. I'm putting what's best for you first, not necessarily party politics. And so I think we have an opportunity in Sheffield to demonstrate democracy working at its best, collaboratively, collectively. And I'm not saying it's going to be easy. Of course it isn't going to be easy. And, you know, of course there's going to have to be compromise and there will be differences. But I think as long as we can transparently and openly show people that there was a process of engagement, discussion, that different perspectives and views were given the opportunity to be aired, and then a decision was reached, then actually maybe we might be onto something. But that will depend on how brave across the political spectrum all our councillors are. They're going to have to learn to talk to each other differently, behave differently, work differently, think differently. And so for me, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because I think, you know, if we look at Sheffield's historical heritage roots of radical social political movements and change, we have always been at the forefront of that. And for me, if we can do that again, well, why not? So it's ours for the taking, saying optimistically, but that isn't going to be an easy road. I'll leave it there, Vicky. I'm conscious of time.
Thank you, Shahida. That's a wonderful sort of position, I think, alongside Paul's. And I think the sort of trying to connect the bigger picture, the local picture, the very human with the sort of processes democracy, the principles of democracy, I think are connections we will come back to in the questions and answers and other people's contributions. Next, I want to call on Django Perks. Django is a member of the Sheffield Youth Cabinet. And so really what I've asked Django to do is not make a statement, but to reflect on what really young people want from democracy, what changes young people might wish to see in the future. So Django, be interested to see what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon, and good evening, everybody. I want to start off by saying that our democracy can have a future. And I'm hopeful that it can have a future, but the way that I look at it and the way that my peers at Sheffield Youth Cabinet look at it, we don't have anything to go and say that at the moment. We are seeing lots of failures within the government and we are seeing policies that are missed out. And I think that goes to show that we can't have any hope at the moment. First of all, thank you for Paul for bringing up that about Votes at 16. I don't know how many of you know, but Votes at 16 recently partnered with the Body Shop to sort of promote that idea of having Votes at 16. And within Youth Cabinet, we're seeing that as a really key issue at the moment. In fact, it's one of our top 3 priorities. And we want that level of influence, you can say, that we would be able to vote at 16. And I know there's a lot of 16, 17-year-olds that really do want to have that voice. But constantly our voices are repressed, and it's not fair on us that our local MPs and our local councillors don't listen to us. When we want to speak to a member of Sheffield City Council, we have to go through Emma, the lead of Sheffield Youth Cabinet, because there's no point in us emailing them, because we would have to email them that many times in order to get a response, and sometimes not even a response. Our voices are constantly oppressed, and it may be down to several reasons. But during the local elections, when people in Wales and Scotland could vote from the age of 16 upwards. That was unfair. It's unfair on those in England, where we are the biggest and we kind of run everything within the United Kingdom and within Great Britain. And the fact that 16 and 17-year-olds couldn't vote compared to those in Scotland and Wales is shocking, I think. And we need to change that urgently for our democracy to go anywhere. There has been referendums in the past, for example, Brexit, where now we are looking at consequences that will take decades to sort out, and it will be down to my generation, the younger generation, to solve these problems. But we didn't have a say in that referendum, in that Brexit vote. So now we have a result that maybe some of us don't agree with, some of us agree with, but we still have problems and we need to solve those. And the younger generation are never consulted. We never get responses from any consultations we've done. We never see actions. And I think I say that on behalf of all constituents sometimes in some areas. And I know that there possibly is a lot of MPs that do listen to their constituents, but I know that there are a lot that don't. And to speak to your constituents and ignore them and not take actions on what they say is shocking, because it was your constituents that voted you into Parliament. And to not give that same level of respect back to the people that you represent and the younger people that you represent as well, that level of respect isn't going to come from your community. There was a study carried out in 2013. I know it was a long time ago, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, and it was carried out by the BBC, and it found that around 3/4 of constituents cannot name their local MP. I find that shocking. It's awful. They were voted in by the constituents and obviously haven't been made as much as an impact as they should have done, but therefore their constituents cannot name them. That's shocking, and I think that needs to change. So the level of engagement from MPs and councillors towards the people that they represent needs to increase. We need to see more MPs and councillors speaking to their constituents. We need to see more MPs and local councillors speaking to the young people. We want, as a youth cabinet, see more engagement from the council and Parliament and all the MPs within Sheffield. We want to see that engagement. And I don't want to have to go to every meeting after a previous meeting with a councillor and say, have we heard from so-and-so as to what the outcome of this is? And having to repeat that question all the time just shows that there isn't any sort of feedback loop. And I go on about feedback loops all the time because they are incredibly important to how discussions, roundtables, etc. work. And it's really, really important that we see the results and we see the actions. So in a way, there are 3 principles that I think we need to work on within the democracy. And those are respect your constituents and listening to them, and then acting upon what they say. So standing up in Parliament and saying, my people said this and I want something to be done about this. And standing up in the council meetings and saying, I want this to be done because people are saying this. But also consulting the people about policies and laws you want to implement. And I'm not saying consult the older generations all the time. And I'm not saying consult all those over the age of 20. We need to look at the impacts on young people. For example, levelling up. Barnsley featured on BBC Panorama about levelling up the other night. And they spent money on a park for young people as part of their levelling up. That was all they were given. Giving them a park for young people, that's not levelling up at all. Just one park, that's not levelling up. Maybe if it was 5 parks, that's levelling up just a bit, but we need to see more levelling up, and we need to see more money, and it needs to be revenue funding, not capital funding, that is going to these areas, and especially Barnsley as well, because they are the most deprived, and they are the most deprived of all the government funds that are ever given. And they have been missed out on a lot of things, and so has Sheffield. We don't see the levelling up that we should be, like the HS2, all the routes that we were going to make were then cut. So it wouldn't run through Sheffield, it wouldn't run through a lot of other areas. And it's terrible that that has happened. And we need to see the consultation occurring within communities. And we need to see councils saying, look, this is what we want to implement. Then why don't we speak to the people? What do you think? What do you think of the impacts on you? What do you want us to change? Do you like what we're going to implement? Do you not like it? But that's not happening, and the respect isn't there, and the councillors and MPs listening to us isn't there, and the actions aren't there, and they're not visible. And I don't just mean getting a letter from them saying thank you for your thoughts, but we need to see more physical and spoken actions within Parliament. And also, we're not going to see more people voting in the next years, because there's people that are turning 18 now that I've spoken to, and they don't know when they can register to vote. They don't know who to vote for. They don't know much about politics, and they're standing in school and saying this and this person's been voted in, and they're just staring at me with blank faces, because there's not that level of education in schools. So for our democracy to change and for our democracy to go on, we need to see improvement. We need to change laws, enact votes at 16, allow 16, 17-year-olds a voice. We need to stop oppressing those people's voices, and we need to ensure that these people are heard all the time, and that for our democracy need to improve and have a future, government and officials, they need to listen to their constituents, and they need to stop putting money over their citizens, because they run this. They do run the money in an aspect, but they shouldn't make decisions based on money. They should make it based on what their citizens think. And I think that's all the time I've got to say. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Django. I think there's a lot to reflect on there. And I think for me personally, to hear young people talking about politics and talking about politics so loosely is at least some hope for the future. So thank you very much, Django. The next person to make a contribution is Anesu Mambingo, who's from the Sheffield Students' Union, where she's Welfare and Sustainability Officer. So Anesu, over to you.
Hi, so I'm going to try and not replicate what's been said already, because some great things have been commented on, and I think it all feeds into climate. When thinking of sort of democracy in its current state, there's a lot of tendencies we've been seeing that are highly anti-democratic. Paul mentioned them, Shahida mentioned them as well, like voter suppression is continually on the rise, the need for voter IDs, the exclusions of millions, and the first past the post voting. And I think there's, for a long time, this sentiment that democracy is no longer working for the people. And it isn't relevant because the social and democratic contract we've sort of been promised hasn't been working. Very few people seem to be in charge and doing their own thing. I suppose accountability was mentioned earlier on, and the lack of accountability to go with that has made it really hard to feel involved in those decisions. And I think previously, before my time, I like to think that there was a general consensus that the government, all the policies and the work they were doing was in order to benefit the people, and it there was that trust that it was benefiting the people. I'm thinking probably before the 70s, there was a lot of the sentiment, and I don't think it's really been there since then. The way democracy is at the moment hasn't adapted. The society has become more complex and more nuanced. And as more voices are being heard, I think there needs to be that shift, which hasn't really happened. There have been sort of grassroots initiatives and things at local scales that are happening, but perhaps on a wider scale, and especially when it comes to discussing climate change, the global climate crisis, it's lacking a bit. There's such a need for more participatory and deliberative forms of democracy, similar to what Shahida was discussing. And I think a lot of the power needs to go back to the local level, and conversations need to include democratizing the economy and how maybe we can link this to ownership. And I think one example of how democracy currently and the way it is isn't efficient or effective is what we're seeing when we talk about climate change and the lack of action that's going on. I suppose it's interesting, we've known about the climate crisis since the 80s at least, and it's widely known now that it's happening. We know what's causing it. We know the solutions that need to happen to sort of tackle it, yet very little is happening. Very little change is happening. I think COP26 recently, as was mentioned before, a few of the students at the University of Sheffield went along with myself. It was such an exciting atmosphere and energy, and there was so much hope before the event about the change that could come from this. And I think it was a very different result we saw. Maybe not on the streets, and I'll come to that later. I think there's loads of energy on the streets and the collective action and the joy and energy that was there. But in the rooms, the fact that phase out coal and the phrasing was very light touch, and there was no mention of oil and gas at all, was quite upsetting. And I think recently Guardian have released an investigation into what they're referring to as carbon bombs. And these are projects that create more carbon than is in line with any of the world's climate commitments. And they've identified 195 of these that are going to be happening within the next decade. One thing I found most interesting about what they've uncovered was how I think it's estimated that 103 million pounds a day will be spent by these oil companies for the rest of the decade. And to me, that almost sounds as though these oil and gas companies don't believe the commitments that these countries are making. If 103 million can still continue to be invested in sort of these projects that are just incompatible with the future we need, it shows that they believe there's still profit and that this kind of thing is going to continue, and that despite all these governments and countries making commitments to net zero, it's not actually going to happen. And I suppose theoretically, if you think of the purpose of democracy, this should be something that democracy should be able to tackle. A functioning democracy is one that enables collectives on whatever scale to come together and to make decisions about their future and enact that change. And I suppose this highlights sort of the lack of democratic efficacy, since that's just clearly not happening. We know exactly what needs to happen, and governments have time and time again sided with the corporates as opposed to with the people. I think when discussing climate change and democracy, it's really important to go back to, I think Paul mentioned it at the very beginning of his speech, about equality and how the two are so deeply interlinked. And a functioning democracy without some level of equality or equity is just not possible. I think if you think of the roots of democracy, it came about because democracy was sort of the answer to allow a more equal society. It was one to maybe overthrow the rich or give power to the working class. It was built from a belief that this is the way to achieve equality, and that's shifted a lot as we continue to see the 0.1% growing in sort of their wealth, while and not being held accountable to the same level and degree as the rest of the population. So I think when thinking of sort of climate change and democracy, it's so key that we consider social justice as well. And when discussing all these things and discussing who's engaging in democracy, it's very interlinked to sort of who has the resources and time as well, to give to these causes, and to give to a structure that's set in a way that perhaps excludes them. As was mentioned before, it's built to perpetuate and continue to give power to those who already have it. I think there's such a need to embrace all forms of participation. We see with sort of the policing bill, there's further restrictions happening on forms of protest, and there's the cost of living crisis, making it even harder for people to participate in these different forms of democracy. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of attention being focused maybe on the national scale into how we can include these people who perhaps are unable to engage with it in the current way it is. I think apathy was another thing that was mentioned earlier. And I have such a love-hate with the way in which people talk about young people not engaging with democracy. I suppose Django is a perfect example of, there is that desire and there's that want, but if we almost take a step back, in order to affect democracy, we need to be affecting the equality and the power structures we see. And it almost feels sometimes as though it's not going to happen or it's not going to change. And I think it's understandable how people feel as though they have no agency over the democratic structure as it is currently, because in their lived experiences, these structures haven't delivered any of their wishes. It's not provided them anything that they've asked for. So why then would you think that current state democracy is going to be the solution to tackle sort of inequality or the climate crisis? And I suppose the impression, I think the future and what we need from this new democracy is definitely sort of that participation and bringing it back to what people on small scales are looking for and how people are organizing and scaling that up. I think that if you sort of see and like consider, like, people aren't seeing the changes they want to be seeing at protests. We have masses and masses of people who've gathered around COP26. I think it was one of the largest protests we've seen in years. We have sort of people speaking to their local councils and not seeing the change they want to be seeing. We have people voting in elections, and again, the system not providing those results they want to be seeing. It's understandable that people feel as though the system's not serving them. I think that democracy hasn't really worked since the 70s, and in order to change and to bring it back to a positive note and maybe light and think to the future of how we could be doing it, for me personally, one thing that really excites me about democracy, and one thing that I think sort of needs to be implemented and made more of a priority, is the joy that comes in collective creation and action. I know I feel very fueled and energized and not apathetic at all when I'm organizing for something, when sort of volunteering at my park run or being at a protest and seeing just the number of people who are working to make change. And perhaps with party politics, it seems too far removed in that you're doing these things and the effect and the result is not always seen, which can be quite a challenge. I think that showing that democracy can work on the small scale and bringing back that sort of energy and applying that to the bigger picture is maybe what we need. And I think a lot of the time, joy is something that is missed a lot. I'm quite a firm believer that democracy does happen a lot in the streets. Having been to sort of COP26 in Glasgow, one of the chants that I loved was sort of, this is what democracy looks like. If people are saying, with all these people around me, this is what democracy is. This is people showing up. We're talking about lack of participation and lack of engagement, but we have masses coming together at these points. I think the question is then, how do we bring more people in, make it as inclusive as possible, and use these structures to be legitimate forms of democracy? I think obviously democracy can't only happen in the streets, but equally it can't only happen with representational democracy. I think there's sort of a middle ground that needs to be explored, where the energy and the power that's coming from the streets and that people are protesting, and that if people are using social media effectively and they see that as a way to collectively mobilize and use that to seek change, go ahead. If people like to come to person and speak to their MPs, do that. And I think we need to change and adapt the way in which we see democracy, because times have changed a lot, and I'm not sure the structures of democracy have. And if we're going to tackle some of the biggest issues of our world, like the climate crisis and like equality, it needs to adapt. But that's everything from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Anesu. I have a number of questions, but before I go on to those questions, I think what I'd like to do is get a response from Paul and to Shahida to those last two presentations, because from the chat I'm getting, people are just being filled with so much hope that young people are expressing themselves so well, and so engaged with politics. So perhaps before we get on to the questions, Paul and Shahida, could I ask you in turn just to make a quick response to what you've heard? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be brief. I mean, I think that in terms of the kind of bigger picture here, I hope the discussion will focus on some of the practical changes we need to address to kind of meet Django and Anesu's aspirations for how democracy might work, because we kind of, that's what we need to look at. How do we change our democracy to make it more effective in practical terms? I mean, I hear your frustration, Django, but I think there's a bit of a communications issue with the youth cabinet, because if I was ever approached as an MP to come along and talk to the youth cabinet, I would. Nobody's ever approached me. I go into our schools, all my secondary schools and some of the primary schools, regularly to listen to students. I've taken their issues directly to Parliament and said, this is what I'm being told by young people, and this is what we should be doing. I'm running a campaign, I've been running a campaign over the last year against sexual harassment in the hospitality sector. That came out of one of the sessions I held with young people in King Ted's. So don't despair. There is actually a willingness to engage both from MPs and from councillors. We just need to find the way that we connect more effectively, clearly. And again, I try to make a positive note, so in terms of the big debate about democracy, you're absolutely right. I share your frustrations. You know, climate's been one of the issues I've worked on since I was elected as an MP 12 years ago. I share your frustrations that we're not moving quickly enough. But it is worth, I think, recognizing that it is the democratic countries that have driven the world towards the measures which are inadequate, but not, you know, we wouldn't even be there if it wasn't for the democratic countries, because China wasn't going to drive the world towards climate action. Russia wasn't going to drive the world towards climate action. Other totalitarian regimes weren't going to do that. It was because of the dynamic of people engaging with democratic politics within countries like ours that has got us to where we are. Where we are isn't far enough, and we certainly need to look at how we can do that better.
I'd just like to start by saying actually that listening to Anesu and Django really did inspire me and give me hope. Actually, you're the future of democracy. And you know, we can try and tackle the structures and the systems to try and enable you and empower you to make decisions that can impact you locally, regionally, nationally and internationally. I think one of the things for me that is really, really important, and I think Anesu, you talked about this, you know, from a street level, from a grassroots level, around the world on the issue of climate change, indigenous groups, you know, all around the world, from Canada, Australia, you know, if you look at the farmers movement in India, these are movements that were at a street level, but these are movements that changed national legislation and in times international legislation as well. But they were also driven by people who are at the sharp end of when decisions and democracy doesn't work. Climate change impacts indigenous communities around the world first. It impacts women of colour, people of colour first. It impacts young people first. And actually seeing that solidarity and collective approach from a street level to a grassroots level to a city and a community and a country and a world level movements happen not because of the big actions and the big decisions, but movements happen because of the little steps and the little reaching out and the small voices that come together to create one collective big voice. And so what I would say to you as young people, you can shape the world better than we ever could, and not because we didn't have the chances or the opportunities. Yeah, we face so many barriers, we face so many issues, but you know what, the one thing I would say about hope, and I think Anesu, you mentioned this about joy, one of the things that I get joy from is listening to young people who have aspirations and a desire to change the world and make it better, and you can absolutely do that. The one thing that inspired me as a young person was all those amazing mentors and people that I learned from during my life, who actually said to me, Shahida, there is nothing you can't do. You want to do it, you can do it. And the power of somebody saying to you, I believe in you, you can do whatever you set your mind to, don't let the world put up a barrier, you can do that, is a really powerful statement. I think that's the one thing. The other thing I would want to say to Django is, it is frustrating when you voiced your worries and concerns and issues, and you feel unheard, and you kind of think, well, hold on, I've spoken to my local councillors and my local MPs and nobody's come back to me, and I didn't even get a response. And that's just kind of touching on Paul's point about communications and pathways of engagement. One of the lessons I learned very, very young, and there are people in Sheffield who will attest to this, that if you don't get heard, there are other ways to be heard. And if the traditional pathways of engagement and communication don't work, make your own. And there are many people in many places in Sheffield who will tell you that, you know, I don't get an agenda or an invite to a meeting, but if I think that meeting's important and I find out about it, I'll go and invite myself. And what I'm saying is, you have lots of power, and sometimes, you know, holding others to scrutiny and to account is important, but sometimes taking back your own power is just as important as well. And you can affect decisions, and you can affect and impact at a local, regional, national level. And I think sometimes vesting in your own power and your own place and your own position and your own voice is just as powerful as vesting that in others. So I would want to say to both of you, keep doing what you're doing, keep inspiring, and there is nothing as powerful as hope. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Shahida. I have a number of questions from the participants, and what I'm going to try and do is direct those to each of you rather than the whole panel, because otherwise we just spend time on one question. One of the first questions to come in from Tina was one which I imagine I can ask Anesu to respond to, is that the super rich seem to have undue power and influence. And I think this sense of powerlessness around major issues is something many of us feel. So I wonder if you could just perhaps reflect on how maybe we can expose and challenge, you know, the power, the undue power that the super rich seem to have. Anesu.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it is clear, especially with everything going on. I think Paul mentioned about sort of everything that's happened around COVID and the impact that was shown. It's quite clear that the sort of 1% live to a different set of rules than the rest of us, and it can be quite hard-hitting to think of what can I do and what can we as a community do. And I think one thing is accountability and making noise, and being overt and ensuring that they're aware that we don't allow things like this to happen. I think it's really difficult when they begin sort of changing policy to fit their own mandate. And to be honest, I'm not sure technically what we can do, because so much has happened already in which the government has not been accountable. I work in sort of students' unions, and I know there's sort of students who had to resign for littler things than our government has. But I do think that it's sort of, as more and more people are becoming engaged with what's going on in the politics of what's happening, and are feeling as though they're starting to have space in these rooms, I think it'll become harder and harder for the, sort of the 1% to continue in the way that they're going on, because they are suppressing the views of other people, and there'll come a point where there is no more. I think if we think of sort of the democratic rights of the working class and sort of the battle that went on there, it was at a point, I think Shahida was alluding to this as well, at how it is a shame that a lot of big changes come from a point of sort of, we can't go on like this anymore. But I think that as that continues, hopefully we can see them being held more to account and structures working in our favor. I'm not sure if that answered your question completely, but it might be, hopefully it's helpful.
No, thank you. Django, I wonder if I could ask you just to respond to one of the questions, if you can. One of the questions, I think what's behind it is the confrontational nature of politics, certainly as politics is portrayed perhaps in the media. And I think what the suggestion is that sort of confrontation distracts from the priorities that many people actually face. I mean, have you got a sense of, does confrontation put you off, or is the way that politics is portrayed in the media, how might we change that, do you think?
I think confrontation within inter-parties and inter-party relationships have definitely put people off. I speak to people, young people especially, all the time, and they say, well, what's the point? We're all the same. They all argue. We don't want to watch them in the House of Commons because they all argue and that's all you hear. And I think there needs to be now a point where we need to get to a point where parties are working together. And that does mean having to find compromises all the time, and it can get a bit messy and it can get a bit annoying sometimes. But what I'm getting when I speak, what the sense I'm getting when I speak to people is that they don't know who to vote for because they don't know whether that they can trust any party, no matter who they are, whether they're Labour, whether they're Conservative, whether they're Lib Dem. I think we need to, when I speak to people in the future, I want to get in a sense that people do want to vote, that they don't want to put off their vote because there's some argument going on within two parties. And it does put people off, and it puts young people off, especially because they want to grow up and they want to vote, but they can't because they don't know who to vote for. There's no education in school, but voting definitely puts stuff like the arguments and the Partygate and all the other things that go on. It makes it too complicated and it distracts people away from a party's policies. And that does need to change. And there does need to be clearance on what a party is doing. And I mean, the simple solution is don't go and break the rule whilst you're in charge of the government. It's not that hard to do. And I think parties need to start getting a sense of that we're not getting anywhere with the public. So we need to start working with the public, and we need to start finding solutions by compromising. And yes, some people won't always be happy and some people will be very happy. It's just one of those things where you need to find a middle way, you need to find a compromise.
Okay, thanks, Django. Something that follows on from that, a question has come in, maybe I can ask Paul to respond to, which is the role of parties? I mean, our democracy is very much tied to our party system. And I think some perhaps think that the party system and particular standpoint of parties, such as on PR, actually prevents the changes in democracy that we perhaps require. Paul, any comment on that perhaps?
Well, I think parties are probably maligned. I mean, I think that what parties are, they're almost like campaign groups. You know, they are collectives of people who share broadly similar values and want to come together to achieve those values. I think that first past the post, our electoral system, forces coalitions within parties. So Labour, there are a wide range of views. The Tories are fundamentally split at their core between kind of English nationalists and one nation Tories. And for me, one of the benefits of proportional representation is it will broaden choice and allow, in a sense, the electoral coalitions behind parties to be more open. But I think parties themselves, as kind of collectives of people coming together to achieve objectives, are fine. I hear kind of Django's frustration with the way that Parliament's presented, and I mean, I hate Prime Minister's questions. I mean, that's kind of Punch and Judy nonsense, which kind of doesn't do our politics any credit at all. And in a sense, you know, the way that the theatre of Parliament is presented is you know, does us a lot of damage to the binary presentation. There is a lot of working behind the scenes across parties. You know, I work regularly with MPs on different issues where we can reach agreement, but we also need to recognise that there are profound disagreements which we have to find a way of debating maturely. You know, the values between the Conservative Party in terms of low tax, low spend on public services, you know, is profoundly different from Labour's view in terms of investing in the public realm and investing in our health service and so on. We need to recognise there are arguments to be had, but we need to find a better way of doing it.
Thanks, Paul. Another theme in the questions, which maybe I can ask Shahida to respond to, since you spoke about the local situation, in particular change in the city council arrangements, I think a lot of people are asking for more devolution locally. Now, this isn't devolving down to the city region, which I think is fairly abstract for most people, but what should or would local devolution within Sheffield look like for you, Shahida?
I think we've been through so many changes over the last 10 or 12 years, what with austerity, and then obviously coming out of that with the pandemic, the cost of living, and there's been a huge amount of quite, you know, seismic changes that have happened internationally, nationally, and locally. And I think at a local level, all of those factors play into at a local level. And when you're talking about devolved decision making at Sheffield, I think one of the first things we need to do in Sheffield is take a good look around us first, see who's still left. And I'll give you a quick example of that. The Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, refugee sector of the voluntary community, faith, social enterprise sector in Sheffield, just before 2014, made up 12% of that sector. When the pandemic hit, that was less than 3% of the sector. Now, the reason why I'm giving that stark figure there is because of the disparity when we're talking about inequalities, when we're talking about, and that decision making is so important, because if local people do not have a sense of ownership, do not have a sense of place, and do not have a sense of their place within those decisions, then, you know, when we have serious issues, and we've, you know, climate change is not going away, it's going to get worse. We are going to need local people's support to help us overcome so many issues. And I think for me, first thing we need to do is have a look with a fresh pair of eyes at our city, and sector by sector, who's there, what are they doing, what are their purposes, how are they serving Sheffield citizens. That's the first thing. I think the next thing we need to do is also have a real sense of how do we hold ourselves accountable to Sheffield citizens and Sheffield people. And the way to do that is empower through making sure that local people have a means of being involved, have voice, have influence, have pathways, have engagement to being involved in those decisions. And right now, those structures are all in a state of flux. And what we've got to try and do is create with communities, co-produce, but with communities, a sense of ownership of the city of Sheffield and respond to those needs locally. I think somebody put in the chat earlier, you know, the Ukraine war is happening, but how is that going to get me a GP's appointment in Sheffield? And it's about making those connections for people to say, you know, both those things are equally just as important. But how do we enable that and enact that change at a local level? And for me, that starts with listening to local people, because local communities and local people have their own solutions and their own answers to that. And I think we've got to be brave enough to respond to that and listen to that. And the one thing that COVID showed is when the rule book was out the window and we had no choice but to rely on each other, and we had no choice but to listen to our communities in order to get those responses out there, it worked. And it worked time and time again because we invested in our local people, and they told us exactly where we needed to be, exactly what we needed to do, and how resources should have been spent. And it was absolutely transformational, the change and the impact that we had for some of our and all of our communities, actually. And I think for me, local democracy and local decision making starts with people. At its simplest, it starts with people, and that's at a micro level, and at a macro level, it's about responding to what those people have said.
Thanks, Shahida. We're beginning to run out of time. So what I'd like to do is just to finalize, I suppose, where we are and ask each member of the panel in turn, what one change would they like to see to our democracy? What one thing would they say, yes, that's what's really needed? So Paul, first of all, could I ask you to think about one thing you'd like to?
It's more complicated than one thing, but proportional representation, I think, would be a transformational change, but it's in the context of the objective of working to build democracy and thinking hard about how we do that.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Django, one thing you'd like to see?
Like Paul, I struggle to think of one thing, but I think more respect from MPs and councillors, and more MPs and councillors listening to the people that they represent and were chosen to represent.
Okay, thanks, Django. Anesu, what one thing might you?
I think my one thing would be more. So it's really hard to think of one thing, as was said earlier. I suppose it would perhaps be more power to local government and local levels. I think there used to be a lot of that, and I think that's where sort of the motion in the streets can be taken locally and can feed into grassroots collective action and then go nationally and continue to grow. But yeah.
Okay, thanks. And finally, Shahida, one thing perhaps you'd like to see?
I think what I would like to see is a radical mindset change across the political spectrum in Sheffield. I would like to see, kind of going on from Django's point, about how our elected councillors and MPs across the political spectrum, you know, we have an opportunity to do things differently in Sheffield. Are you brave enough to make that happen?
Okay, thank you, Shahida. That's time up on our session. I get a sense that a lot of the chat as well feels rather frustrated, since we seem to have opened a Pandora box of issues and debates that people want to pursue. And clearly we expected that. But I think, if nothing else from this evening, I hope people have also taken hope that whilst we might be frustrated and upset about current state of democracy, that there are debates being held and we should continue to have those debates. And I think we've heard voices tonight which obviously wish to contribute that in the future. I'll now hand over to Vicky to do a sign off from the Sheffield for Democracy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. That's been fascinating to hear that. I've been really, I've been sitting here kind of enthralled with the things that people have said. I understand the frustration. I understand the anger, and what people have said about the need to build local democracy. I absolutely agree with that, and we in Sheffield for Democracy have been doing our bit, or trying to do our bit, but it is incredibly difficult given the way in which local authorities have been underfunded by our national government. And it's something we really, really have to find a way of working on together. And I'm very much hoping that we can continue to engage with Django and Anesu and Shahida about the issues you have raised, and continue to make the points that you're making that we agree with, and that we would love to find stronger coalitions, stronger alliances across different groups in Sheffield to push those issues. We are very open to discussing it. We know some councillors are, we know some MPs are, some aren't, some are. Not all MPs are the same, not all councillors are the same. That's been my experience. But I understand a lot of the public thinks they're all the same, they don't listen. And I think we have to find ways of making sure there are structures in place and that people do feel they're listened to. Although I have to say, it isn't just young people who don't feel their voices are heard. Lots of us who are on the other side, the other end of the age spectrum, don't feel that some of our voices are heard either. But I really, really want to say thank you very much to all our speakers and the people who are asking questions, and to those of you who have attended. And that's been really great to have you here. And for those of you who aren't yet on our email list, do please, I'm going to put in a minute, I'm going to put my email address in the in the chat, and you can email me and we can add you to our mailing list. But thank you very much everybody for coming this evening.
Okay, well, Vicky gets that email address in there for you all. It just remains for me to say thanks again one more time. And if you want to continue talking about the issues that have been raised here tonight, we do have our Future of Democracy Hub Day, which is taking place at Sheffield Town Hall on Saturday from 10:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. It's free with a suggested donation of £5, but obviously we do not want in any way for price to be a barrier to people, so it is free for you to come along, and we hope to see some of you there. We'll have lots of great speakers lined up then for you as well. Vicky, do you want to just say your email address out? Would that be quicker? No, okay, we're getting it. So the rest of the events, as I say, are available on festivalofdebate.com, and we are on all of the usual social media channels. So you are welcome to send feedback and join the conversation there. And that email address, if you want to get in touch with Vicky, is vickyseddon2012@gmail.com, in case you haven't seen it in the chat. Thank you very much. Good night, everybody.